Lecture 29, The Doctrine of Traits. Before we continue with our discussion of the three dialectics in social interaction, I want to step aside for a moment to spend some time talking about the notion of the personality trait, which is one of the most important and one of the most controversial concepts in all of personality and social psychology. First, let's begin with a more formal statement of what the doctrine says. This is a quote from Gordon Allport in his 1937 personality text. A trait is a generalized and focalized neuropsychic system with the capacity to render many stimuli functionally equivalent and to initiate and guide consistent, equivalent forms of adaptive and expressive behavior. Already in 1937, Allport distinguished between two quite different construals of personality traits, the biosocial view and what he called the biophysical view. According to the biosocial view, which Allport attributed to social psychologists and sociologists, traits have only nominal existence. They're a way of labeling people and their behaviors. We call people friendly, we call them extroverted, we call them neurotic, and these are just ways of labeling people. But from Allport's own point of view, which he called the biophysical view, traits have actual existence. Personality traits like friendliness and extroversion exist in exactly the same way that physical traits like height and weight and skin color do, which is why Allport defined a personality trait as a neuropsychic system. He really meant that traits had an actual existence in the nervous system, and particularly in the brain. In the same way that what you learn and perceive and remember is represented somehow in the brain, so Allport believed traits were represented in the brain. And the first thing these traits do is to render many stimuli functionally equivalent. Allport wasn't a stimulus response theorist, but he was working with the vocabulary of SR theory here. And what he meant by this was that traits cause people to respond to many different stimuli in functionally equivalent sorts of ways. So if you possess the trait of friendliness, you'll respond in a friendly manner in lots of situations. If you possess the trait of neuroticism, you'll be anxious and worried all the time. Traits also initiate and guide consistent forms of adaptive and expressive behavior. Here we get to the heart of the doctrine of traits, which is that Allport believed that traits caused people to behave the way they did. Traits initiate and guide behavior. That doesn't mean that a friendly person will smile all the time, but it does mean that friendly people will tend to behave in a friendly way, whether they're smiling or whatever they're doing, and they behave in a friendly way precisely because they are friendly. They have the trait of friendliness. Precisely because traits are assumed to have actual existence, it makes sense to develop instruments that can measure them, just the way we have scales of height and weight, and, for that matter, tests of intelligence. And like intelligence tests, personality tests have to have various psychometric properties: standardization, norms, reliability, validity, and utility. And these are understood in the domain of personality testing in exactly the same way as they're understood in the domain of intelligence testing. There has to be a standardized form of the test, and it has to be administered to the subjects in a standardized way, so that everybody gets the same measurement. There have to be norms, preferably based on a representative sample of the population at large, which permit us to compare an individual's score to the scores of other people, and thereby be able to interpret what the individual's score means. Let's say a little bit more about reliability. An assessment device is useful only to the degree that it yields a precise measurement of the attribute in question. A rubber ruler is not as reliable as one made of steel because it can be bent and stretched and compressed. The easiest way to determine reliability is to see whether multiple measurements of the same object by the same instrument yield the same scores. When two or more observers use a test simultaneously to make judgments about a person, the agreement between them is called inter-rater or inter-judge reliability. When a single observer makes trait ratings about a person on 2 or more different occasions, this is called test-retest reliability. In both cases, reliability is indicated by high correlations between the different observations. A more complicated form of reliability is known as internal consistency. With certain attributes of people, such as height and weight, a single measurement, in inches or pounds or whatever, is all that's required. But investigators of personality traits have not been able to settle on any single unambiguous test for the dimensions that interest them, trait dimensions like extroversion and agreeableness. Rather, they have to rely on multiple measurements, each being an imperfect measurement of the trait. This is why personality scales typically consist of more than one item. There might be dozens of items on a scale of neuroticism or extroversion. Now, if each of these items constitutes a more or less imperfect measurement of the trait in question, then they all ought to correlate with each other. And internal consistency is essentially a measure of the degree to which each of the items on a scale correlates with each of the other items on the scale. Another way of thinking about internal consistency is in terms of the item to total correlation. If you've got a scale of extroversion that consists of 12 items, then each of those 12 items ought to correlate with the total scale score. While reliability has to do with the precision or the accuracy of measurement, validity has to do with the question of whether the test really measures what it's supposed to measure. The point here is that reliable tests are not necessarily valid. A steel ruler will give you a consistent measurement of something, but it's not a valid measure of weight. It's only a valid measure of length or height. So the fact that a test is reliable, that it gives us consistent measurements, raises the question of validity. What's the consistent measurement a measurement of? In general, there are several different forms of validity considered in psychometric theory. First of all, the test should possess content validity. Its items should be representative samples of the domain being measured. A subject's reading ability is not validly measured by a test which contains only mathematics problems. The items in the test ought to have something to do with the trait in question, and for that matter, the items on a test ought to be a representative sample of the universe of content being measured by that test. A mathematics test that contained only addition problems, and not subtraction and multiplication and division problems as well, would lack content validity because it doesn't range over the entire content of mathematics ability. Similarly, a scale of friendliness shouldn't simply focus on one behavior, like smiling. A good test of a trait will sample the entire range represented by the domain of that trait. Usually, the items of a test make intuitive sense. They appear to have something to do with the trait in question. If so, the test is said to possess face validity. A scale of friendliness might ask questions about smiling, and how many friends you have, and how eager you are to make new friends. It might very well be that friendly people have shorter fingernails than non-friendly people, but a test of friendliness that asked about the subject's fingernail length would not be one that has face validity. Its validity would have to be demonstrated in some other way. Well, how? How would you demonstrate the validity of a test item that wasn't valid on the face of it? You accomplish this by means of what's known as empirical validity, establishing an empirical correlation between responses to the test item and the trait in question. If we know who's friendly and who isn't, and we determine that friendly people have longer fingernails than hostile people, then fingernail length would have empirical validity. Similarly, for tests as a whole, we say that a personality scale has empirical validity when it actually predicts how people will behave with respect to the trait in question. A scale of friendliness has empirical validity if it predicts whether people will smile or not. A test of conscientiousness has empirical validity if it predicts whether people will be punctual or not. Empirical validity is sometimes called external validity because the scale is validated against some external criterion of the trait in question. Finally, what we call construct validity really has to do with our theoretical conception of the trait in question. It might be the case empirically that friendly people have longer fingernails or shorter fingernails than non-friendly people. And so, we could include fingernail length as an item on our test of friendliness purely on grounds of empirical validity. But for the item to have construct validity, there has to be a theory of friendliness that explains why an item is an item on the test. In this case, a theory that explains why friendly people would have longer or shorter fingernails than non-friendly people. An item on a test could have empirical or external validity without having face validity. And an item on a test can have empirical validity without having construct validity. But in the best test, the items have all four kinds of validity. Items are included on a test because they're theoretically relevant, because they make intuitive sense, because they sample the entire universe of content, and because they are empirically correlated with some criterion of trait performance. And finally, of course, psychometric tests ought to have utility. Assuming that reliability and validity are held constant, a short test is more efficient than a long test. Similarly, a test that is easier and cheaper to administer and score has more utility than one that is harder or more expensive. You get the same benefit at lower cost. With respect to the Big Five personality traits, in some respects the gold standard for measurement is a series of personality questionnaires known as the NEO Personality Inventory, and its short form, the NEO Five-Factor Inventory, developed by Paul Costa and Robert McRae beginning in the 1980s. These inventories provide measurements of each of the Big Five personality traits. While the NEO Personality Inventory consists of a very wide set of items, the NEO Five-Factor Inventory contains only about 60 items and thus provides very efficient measurement. For example, the NEO Personality Inventory assesses 6 different facets of extroversion, 6 different aspects of this big personality trait: interpersonal warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement-seeking, and positive emotions. There are 8 items for each of these facets, so the whole extroversion scale consists of 48 items. Each of the items is phrased as a self-description, and subjects are simply asked to indicate on a 5-point scale the extent to which they agree or disagree with the statement. By breaking up the trait of extroversion into its various facets, McRae and Costa tried to guarantee that their test would have content validity. The scales have external validity because McRae and Costa have shown that the scales actually do predict how subjects will behave in various kinds of situations. And the scale has construct validity because these items were written based on a theoretical understanding of the trait in question. The measurements provided by the NEO Personality Inventory are highly reliable, with very high levels of internal consistency and test-retest reliability. Of course, the questionnaire itself is a standardized procedure. There are standardized ways of scoring the scale, and the authors have provided norms for test performance based on a pretty representative sample of the population. The scale has everything you would want in personality measurement. And here's what the distribution of extroversion scale scores looks like, based on a large sample of college students that I tested at the University of Arizona in 1991, using the shorter version of the NEO, the 60-item 5-factor inventory. You can see that the distribution is fairly normal, with very few people with very high scores, very few people with extremely low scores, and most people somewhere in between. A pretty good bell-shaped curve. And, by the way, one that's not an artifact of the Z transformation. These are raw scores. Here we have some sample items from the NEO neuroticism scale. Again, neuroticism has been broken down into several facets: anxiety, angry hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability. And subjects were asked to make behavioral self-reports. And here's the distribution of neuroticism scale scores based on that same sample of college students. Again, you see a fairly normal distribution. Not too many scoring high on the scale, not that many scoring low on the scale either, most people falling somewhere in between. Notice that the modal scale score for neuroticism, 36, is considerably lower than the modal scale score that we saw for extroversion, which was 48. The average college student apparently isn't as neurotic as he or she is extroverted. And if you look at the extremes, there are more people with extremely low scores than there are with extremely high scores. And if you had to choose, that's the way you'd want it to be. Let's now proceed through the other three of the big five personality traits. Here's agreeableness, again broken down into several facets: trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and what the authors call tender-mindedness, which is a kind of old-fashioned term for people who are kind-hearted and optimistic, a soft touch. And here you can see the distribution of agreeableness scores. We've moved back up the scale. The modal score is 45. More people are agreeable than disagreeable, which I think is probably your experience. It's my experience. And again, a nice bell-shaped curve. Here, the various facets of conscientiousness: competence, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. And here's the distribution. Again, skewed towards the high end. College students, after all, they play hard, but they also work hard. And finally, openness to experience, again broken down into 6 facets: fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, ideas, actions, and values. Notice that fantasy, aesthetics, and feelings have to do with openness to inner experiences, imagination, feelings of absorption. Openness in the domains of ideas, actions, and values has more to do with socio-political liberalism or traditionalism. So openness is kind of a hodgepodge. Still in all, these items hang together, as indicated by the strong levels of internal consistency that the scale possesses. And here are the scores. Again, a pretty normal distribution of scores, a fairly bell-shaped curve, with the modal response a little bit lower, down around 39, compared to extroversion and agreeableness and even conscientiousness. Openness to experience pretty much defines college life, but there are plenty of college students who have conservative political and social values. And so whatever openness that college students as a group might have in the domains of fantasy, aesthetics, and feelings is probably tempered by some conservatism in the domains of actions, ideas, and values. Here, just for the sake of comparison, I've put all 5 of the distributions together on the same graph. You can see that the outlier here is neuroticism. College students on average score pretty high on extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, but they score considerably lower on neuroticism. College students have worries and they have anxieties like everybody else, but on the whole, they're a pretty emotionally stable bunch of people. And here, just for the record, are the correlations among these scales measuring the big 5 personality traits. Within each of the scales, of course, the correlations among the various facets are very high. People who are high in interpersonal warmth also tend to be high in gregariousness, assertiveness, activity levels, excitement-seeking, and positive emotionality. People who are high in anxiety also tend to be relatively high in angry hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability. So the various facets within each trait hang together, and that's pretty much guaranteed by that psychometric standard of internal consistency. But between the scales, you can see that the correlations are relatively low. Knowing where they stand on neuroticism, for example, doesn't really help you predict where people are going to stand on extroversion, openness, agreeableness, or conscientiousness. There's not a lot of redundancy in the Big Five structure of personality. Each of these 5 dimensions is providing unique information about a person that's not supplied by the other scales. The average correlation is pretty close to 0. Why it's not even closer to 0 is something I'll talk about in a couple of moments. Once these basic traits of personality have been identified, and a technology like the NEO Personality Inventory has been developed to measure them, research can then proceed on the nature of traits, their origins, and their influence on the individual's experience, thought, and action. And that brings us back to the doctrine of traits, which, you'll remember, comes in 2 views. What I call the weak version of the doctrine of traits, also known as the biosocial view, says that traits merely summarize certain properties of individual social behavior. Its coherence, stability over time, consistency across situations, and predictability. I'll talk more about these features in the rest of the lecture. But the strong version, which is Allport's biophysical view of traits, is that traits cause these features of behavior to occur. They cause social behavior to be coherent, stable across time, consistent across situations, and predictable. Traits are not merely biosocial categories for labeling behaviors and labeling people. Instead, they are biophysical entities that exist in the nervous system, much like reflexes or memories do, presumably forming part of the individual's brain structure. By virtue of this physical existence, they cause or dispose people to behave in certain ways across a wide variety of situations. So when we ask the question of what function traits have, what they do, the first thing they do is to give coherence to the individual's social behavior. First, traits give coherence to topographically different behaviors, such as smiling or initiating conversation, that tend to co-occur precisely because they're different manifestations of a particular trait, such as friendliness. The trait of friendliness causes them to smile, and it also causes them to initiate conversation. And because it causes both of these things, it also causes a correlation between them. These are topographically different behavioral measures of the same underlying trait. Traits also produce coherence among semantically different traits, such as friendliness and adventuresomeness. These 2 traits tend to co-vary because they're different facets of some higher order trait, such as extroversion. Extroversion causes people to be friendly, and it also causes people to be adventuresome. Friendliness and adventuresomeness, they don't mean the same thing. They are semantically different traits, but because they're produced by this higher order trait of extroversion, they tend to be correlated with each other. Friendly people tend to be adventurous. In the same way that smiling and initiating conversation hang together, or cohere, friendliness and adventuresomeness tend to hang together. They also tend to cohere. The result is a hierarchical structure of personality, the sort of thing that would be familiar to you from our discussion of concepts, in which there are very broad superordinate traits, then basic level traits nested underneath them. Certain behavioral regularities nested underneath these basic traits, and then specific behaviors at the very lowest level of the hierarchy. So again, in this hierarchical structure of personality and social behavior, we have fairly abstract entities like personality traits at the superordinate levels of the hierarchy, and more concrete actions like specific behaviors at the subordinate levels. You can think of the Big Five as being at the level of secondary traits, and the various facets of the Big Five at the level of primary traits. The individual scale items would represent the level of habitual actions. Remember, personality questionnaire items typically ask people what they're like in general, or how they behave in general. Within a scheme like this, the Big Five traits, being very few in number and very broad and abstract in nature, seem to occupy the position of secondary traits near the top of the hierarchy of personality. But perhaps not at the very top, because there seems to be a higher order resolution of the Big Five structure. Remember that the correlations among the Big Five traits are not precisely zero. They're far from a perfect 1.0, that's for sure, but they're also not at zero. What this means is that they themselves can be subsumed under even broader dimensions. Work by Seymour Rosenberg and his colleagues suggests that there's a tertiary level of analysis that consists of two very broad traits based on two aspects of social desirability. There are some traits that are very socially desirable and other traits that are not so desirable. Rosenberg called these traits intellectual good-bad and social good-bad. Intellectual good-bad is basically the dimension running from intelligent to unintelligent. Social good-bad is the dimension running from warm, agreeable, and sociable on the one end to hostile, cold, and aloof on the other. Extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness are all socially desirable personality characteristics, as is emotional stability, the opposite of neuroticism. As for openness to experience, that probably counts as a socially desirable intellectual characteristic. So at the tertiary level of analysis, we've got what you might think of as the big two: intellectually desirable qualities and socially desirable qualities, with the Big Five nested underneath them, along with intelligence. So intellectual and social desirability represent a level above the secondary traits of the Big Five. What about the next level down? Here, I think we can construe the various facets of the Big Five as primary traits. Extroversion is very broad, very abstract. Interpersonal warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement-seeking, positive emotions, they're all still broad, but a little bit more specific ways of being extroverted. So focusing on just two of the Big Five personality traits, extroversion and agreeableness, as examples, here's how the whole hierarchical structure of personality might look. At the lowest level are habitual actions, repetitions of the same behavior or very similar behaviors in different contexts. For example, a person might tend to be dominant and forceful in his relationships with other people, or usually take a leadership role in groups of which she's a member. These two topographically different behaviors tend to go together as different manifestations of a primary trait of assertiveness. A person might like most people that she meets, and also form strong attachments to friends. These topographically different behaviors are different manifestations of the primary trait of warmth. Similarly, a trusting person believes most people are honest and assumes the best about people, and an altruistic person is courteous to everyone and charitable. So these primary traits, warmth and assertiveness, trust and altruism, summarize clusters of behaviors that tend to co-occur. Warmth and assertiveness are semantically different traits. They don't mean precisely the same thing. Nor do trust and altruism mean the same thing. But warmth and assertiveness as personality traits tend to be correlated with each other as manifestations of a higher order trait of extroversion. Similarly, the semantically different traits of trust and altruism tend to be correlated with each other as manifestations of a higher order trait of agreeableness. And finally, both extroversion and agreeableness are socially desirable personality characteristics. So at the bottom level, we have habitual actions, repetitions of the same behavior in different contexts. At the next level, we have primary traits summarizing clusters of co-occurring habitual actions. At the next level up, we have secondary traits which summarize clusters of co-varying primary traits. And at the highest level, we have tertiary traits which summarize clusters of co-varying secondary traits. Now what's left out of this scheme, partly because I ran out of room on the slide, but also because it's more relevant later, are specific actions in specific contexts, specific episodes of behavior. These reside at the very lowest level of the hierarchical structure of personality. So a person with socially desirable personality traits will tend to be extroverted, and by virtue of being extroverted will tend to be warm, and by virtue of being warm will like most people that she meets. But the question left over is, will this extroverted, warm person who likes most people she meets like some particular person that she encounters in a particular context? Similarly, a person might be agreeable and therefore altruistic and therefore tend to be charitable. But then the question is whether he'll make a contribution to a particular charity and how much of a contribution he'll make. We'll come back to these specific actions later. But this is what personality looks like from the point of view of the doctrine of traits. People engage in habitual actions, but they're not mere habits. Rather, their habitual actions are expressions of certain primary personality traits, which themselves are facets of higher order personality traits, like the Big Five. Okay, so that's what things are like in theory according to the doctrine of traits. Personality has this hierarchical structure to it of primary traits, superordinate traits, habitual actions, and so on. The question now is, what's the empirical evidence for this hierarchical structure? At one level, it's pretty good. The Big Five personality traits, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience, appear to be ubiquitous. They seem to fall out whenever we analyze a reasonably representative body of personality data, whether it's a personality questionnaire like the NEO Personality Inventory, where people report on their own generalized behavioral tendencies, or self-ratings on adjectives, like a representative sample of those 18,000 adjectives we talked about earlier, words like warm and assertive and trusting and altruistic, or whether we choose to have our subjects rated by other people, not just by themselves, other people who know them well. This Big Five structure just always falls out. That's been true for more than 50 years, and it's been true wherever this kind of study has been done. The Big Five personality traits and their various facets and subordinate habitual actions really do seem to hang together to form this structure. However, 2 points ought to be noted. The first is that the Big Five falls out whenever we analyze people's self-reports of their behavior, or when we analyze adjective checklist kinds of responses. But nobody's actually followed around a representative sample of subjects and collected actual behavioral observations of their specific actions in specific situations. That would be really expensive, which is why nobody's done that, and nobody's going to do that. So the Big Five is ubiquitous, but it's ubiquitous only when we base our analyses on particular kinds of data. Data about primary traits and data about habitual behaviors. Moreover, and this is the second point, there are reasons for thinking that the apparent coherence of personality and behavior, the apparent coherence of social behavior around the Big Five personality traits, may be inflated at least a little bit by what we call people's implicit theories of personality. That is, their expectations about how personality ought to hang together. As I said before, the Big Five falls out whenever we analyze people's self-reports at particular levels, primary traits or habitual behaviors, and also when we analyze data that has been contributed by acquaintances, by people who know the subjects well. The problem is that the Big Five also falls out when people rate people that they don't know at all, people they've just met, when they've been brought together in a laboratory room for the very first time. That raises the question of how much coherence resides in the personalities of the people being observed, and how much coherence resides in the minds of the people who are doing the observing. This is a very controversial issue. It hasn't been settled yet. But it is pretty clear that people's ratings of themselves and of other people are influenced to some extent by their implicit theories of personality, by their implicit or unstated beliefs about how personality ought to hang together. Remember how I characterized the Big Five personality structure as the Big Five blind date questions. These Big Five personality traits are the qualities that we look for in ourselves and in other people. So there's a chance that the Big Five personality structure is a kind of illusion. I'm not prepared to go that far, but it does appear to be the case that the Big Five structure of personality, to the extent that it exists, is magnified by our implicit theories of personality, our beliefs and our expectations about what goes with what. Put another way, we're not completely certain yet to what extent the Big Five personality traits are an accurate reflection of the way personality really hangs together, or whether this apparent coherence of personality is a systematic distortion of our beliefs of what personality ought to be like. The next question raised by the doctrine of traits is the extent to which personality is stable over time. To what extent is a person who is warm at age 5 also warm at age 25? A person who is trusting at age 13 also trusting at age 63. Remember that the idea of a personality trait is modeled on physical traits. If you're a tall kid, you're going to be a tall adult. If you've got curly hair as a child, you're going to have curly hair as an adolescent. Some evidence in this regard comes from studies of the test-retest reliability of personality questionnaires and adjective rating scales. Usually, test-retest reliability is calculated only over a period of a couple of days. Subjects will take the test on Monday and take it again on Thursday. But there are some studies in which subjects have been tested 2 or more times over intervals of 10 years or more, and even over such a long interval, most personality questionnaires show appreciable levels of test-retest reliability. So that's one clue that personality is fairly stable. So there is some significant stability to personality, at least so far as people's scores on personality questionnaires are concerned. But there's also appreciable change. And frankly, it turns out that there's probably at least as much variability in personality as there is stability. It's a fair summary of this literature that the stability of personality over time is greatest over relatively short intervals. There is more stability over a period of a year than there is over a period of 10 years. Furthermore, there is more stability at superordinate levels of analysis than there is at subordinate levels of analysis. A person who is extroverted at age 10 is still likely to be extroverted as an adult at age 20 or 30 or 40. Whether a 40 or 50-year-old extrovert still craves excitement the way he or she did as a teenager or a 20-something, that's another question entirely. And a similar conclusion emerges for research on the consistency of behavior across situations. Again, remember that the doctrine of traits says that traits dispose people to behave in ways that are consistent from one situation to another. If you're extroverted in one situation, you ought to be relatively extroverted in another situation. If you're conscientious in one situation, you ought to be relatively conscientious in another situation. Again, there is some consistency of behavior across situations, as predicted by the doctrine of traits, but there's also considerable flexibility. The consistency of personality is greatest across situations that are very similar to each other. A woman who is warm and friendly toward her husband at home is also likely to be warm and friendly toward her children. Of course, it depends a little bit on the husband. But that same person who is warm and friendly at home may not be so warm and friendly at school or at work, or with strangers she encounters at the grocery store. The more similar two situations are, the more consistency we can expect to see in the behavior of the person in those situations. Moreover, it appears that consistency is greatest at superordinate levels of analysis. A person who is extroverted in one situation might also be extroverted in another situation. But in one situation, that extroversion might take the form of interpersonal warmth. In another situation, that extroversion might take the form of assertiveness. Human experience, thought, and action is remarkably flexible and finely tuned to the specific situation in which it occurs. The one thing we know is that no two people are alike. There are huge individual differences in social behavior, and for that matter in non-social behavior. The doctrine of traits says that these individual differences, this variance in behavior, is caused by internal behavioral dispositions, personality traits that are analogous to physical traits, that render behavior coherent, stable, consistent, and predictable. We've seen that there is in fact some coherence to behavior in the form of the Big Five structure of personality. But we've also seen reasons to believe that the apparent coherence of behavior might be magnified to some extent by our beliefs about personality, by our implicit theories about personality. Similarly, there is some stability to personality over long as well as short intervals of time, but there's also considerable variability. In personality, people change. And there's some consistency to personality. People do tend to behave in similar ways from one situation to the next. But in the same way that there's at least as much variability in behavior over time as there is stability, there's at least as much flexibility in behavior from one situation to another as there is consistency. So what about the fourth function of traits, predictability? Remember that according to the doctrine of traits, traits cause people to behave the way they do. And the whole point of measuring personality is to use these measurements to predict how people will behave in specific situations. If someone's extroverted, we expect him or her to be warm. If someone's interpersonally warm, we expect that person to like most of the people that he or she encounters. If a person likes most of the people that he or she meets, then we expect her to like Joe when she's introduced to him by her friends at a party. Knowing somebody's personality traits ought to give us some predictive leverage. It ought to enable us to predict how that person is going to behave, what that person is going to think and feel and want in some specific situation. Here's the short story. There is some predictability to behavior, but that predictability is greatest between adjacent levels of the hierarchy. If we know a person is a good person, has socially desirable traits, then we can confidently predict that he or she will be more or less extroverted and more or less agreeable. If we know a person is extroverted, we can predict that he or she will be more or less warm interpersonally, more or less assertive, more or less inclined towards positive emotions. And if the person is interpersonally warm, we can predict that he or she is going to tend to like most people that he or she meets. And if the person is assertive, we can predict that the person is going to be dominant and forceful in groups. So knowing what a person's traits are, whether they're primary traits or secondary traits, does give us some ability to predict the person's habitual experiences, thoughts, and actions. But what about predicting the person's specific behavior in some specific situation? That's an issue to which we'll turn in our next lecture.